Thanks everybody for joining me. And I've been denying it for a while, but now I have to face the fact that I'm pretty worried about where the direction that the world is taking. There's a lot of imbalance in human and environmental systems, and that's leading to a lot of suffering. And that in turn is leading to a spillover effect where it's creating even more problems in human and environmental systems and downstream problems. If you look at species, for example, as much as a 50 to 70% destruction of species just in the last 50 years, which is a staggering rate. We already know the climate change story and some of the destruction, physical property destruction and human destruction that that's causing. And there's also a lot of turbulence in general. If you look at the Fortune 500 in one 15-year block recently, there was about 80% of the Fortune 500 was replaced. And so a tremendous amount of turnover and instability, and yet at the same time, employee engagement is at a staggeringly low level, 18% worldwide and low 30% range for the United States. And so a lot of uncertainty, but also a lot of disengagement. And mental health disorders are really on the rise, whether it's obesity, depression, anxiety, suicide, substance abuse, and treatment for all our suffering, whether it's with legal substances or illegal substances. And frankly, the fires of conflict are burning all over the world still. So I'm worried. But at the same time, I'm actually optimistic. I think, and here's why. There's an interesting model that is a biological model, simple, powerful, that might be able to explain the cause and the solution for most of this imbalance and suffering. And even beyond the negative, this model will inspire much greater happiness and power in individual lives than we realized possible. And I predict going forward that nothing will be more important than applying this type of model to our lives and our communities. Now, how did this come about? About 27 years ago, started med school, things were going along great, doing well academically, doing well athletically. And then there was a transition from the academic aspect of medical school to the clinical aspect of medical school. And that's where it revealed a big gap in my character, my skills, my diversity, and really realized I didn't have a lot of communication skills, organization skills, a lot of confidence started to drop off, and went from being sort of top of the class type of performer to really dropping off, and that was a real shock to my system. Luckily, I had a friend who had a bookshelf loaded with self-help types of books, mostly devoted towards career types of things, but I gobbled that bookshelf up and it helped me a lot. And for the next 27 years, I actually went even broader than just career success and started looking at what's the science and what's the evidence behind various kinds of practices that lead to career success as well as happiness more broadly. And as a physician and also running and designing medical trials, that helped me go through literature much more rapidly in order to organize the evidence for the different things that I'm about to talk to you about. So here's why I'm optimistic. What's something very interesting over the last 10 years has happened, that we're aware of the fact that we can measure electrical signals and neurochemical and other chemical transmitters throughout the body that collectively, I refer to it as a kind of vitality mix, that as this mix rises, think of yourself as a bucket. The more full the bucket is with this vitality mix of electrical substances and chemical transmitters, this will predict almost everything that matters in your life. It will predict how effective you are, how happy you are, how healthy you are, and even how inspired you are, which in turn then translates into career and relationship success and resistance to everything, negativity, stress, disease even. And so the implications of filling your bucket up and having a full bucket is profound. Now, equally profound is the fact that an empty bucket can explain almost all of the world's problems that we listed earlier on, if you can imagine that. Problems such as anxiety, depression that are on the rise, as we mentioned, obesity, substance abuse, the rise of mental health disorders and the medication for these things, and the disengagement of people, but at the same time, a kind of unconscious drive towards pleasure that sort of helps to self-medicate almost the suffering and imbalance that's going on in the world. All these things can be explained, believe it or not, by this concept of the bucket emptying of your vital mix. And so this in turn then leads to imbalance in the world, which leads to human and global ecosystem imbalances and resulting conflict. And so why is it that now suddenly our buckets are emptying? If that's the point I'm making, why would it happen now? And so that brings an interesting set of thought processes. An interesting twist has occurred in human history. And that is, as I speak to audiences about this subject and ask them, what is the average life expectancy of human beings for most of human history, most of them will answer in the 40s to 50s, when in fact it's in the 20s, which is right away a shocker. And then the question is, why were people living such short lives? And there were a multitude of causes for death for most of human history, and that included predators, whether it's human predators because of scarce resources, animal predators because of a lack of shelter, climate, famine, and the like. And so, for most of human history, life has been sort of a drag. We're constantly dodging bullets left and right and trying to avoid getting killed. And so it was critical for us to adapt a survival ability within ourselves. And so our brains and bodies started to develop mechanisms to be able to become more effective at dealing with these threats. So, and it's very, that's the part of the story that a lot of people do know about, that we have spent most of human history, adapting to become more and more survival ready. Here's where the story gets very interesting, and an aspect of the story that a lot of people don't think about. So the brain developed a scheme. It said, look, body, we are having all kinds of threats out there, and there's certain things that we need us to do in order to survive. And so what we're going to do is we're going to cause a little bit of a neurotransmitter bump in the brain that's going to give us a little bit of a high when we're doing the things that are really good for our survival. And so there's a whole host of things that we really needed to do. We needed to think. We needed to analyze. We needed to communicate. We needed to gather information. We needed to be very hypervigilant, anxious. We needed to have fear responses to self-protect. We needed to be really prone to sex and sugar. These are the things that helped with survival as well as the propagation of the species. And pride was something very important. Social status was important in order to be accepted by the tribe and survive. And so all these things the brain conspired to get us to do in order to potentiate our survival. And so there's different parts of the brain that I call it, in a sense, the lower brain, the survival brain. And medial prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, the ventral tegmental area, a whole alphabet soup of the brain that corresponds to the lower brain. And many know about this aspect of the story as well, but the getting high from within with a neurotransmitter spike is an interesting thing to think about. Now, equally important is the fact that the key to our power and our happiness and our health appears to be the activation of the higher brain. And meditation in particular, and I define meditation very broadly. It can include breathing practices, prayer, various kinds of mantras, mindfulness meditation, defined very broadly, but the key element seems to be silence, lack of thinking and analysis and information communication, etc. Silence seems to lead to greater and greater activation of the higher brain and leads to a filling of the bucket. And all the elements that matter in the bucket, the vital mix, go up. So key parts of the brain, left prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate gyrus, the insula, right brain, all these things start to become more and more active. DHEA levels go up, testosterone levels go up, IL-10 goes up. So all the key things that matter for making you more powerful, more healthy, more effective start to go up with higher brain activation. And so you can see now in every moment, therefore, there's a conflict. You have a finite amount of blood or oxygen that can either go to the lower brain or the higher brain. And so if you are going to be driving all these survival instincts and activating the lower brain, you're taking blood away from the higher brain and therefore causing your bucket to become more and more drained over time. And so something very radical has happened over the last 20 years that makes this even more of an acute problem. And that is, we've gotten too much of a good thing. So a really good analogy is, for most of human history, the taste of sweet was a sign of a food that was really good for us, give us some calories, help us to survive. But then we moved forward and we had all kinds of sugar, processed sugar, much access to sugar, and our teeth started to rot. Similarly, if you look at all 10 of these different kinds of survival behaviors and instincts, having too much of those in effect rots the brain, because you're taking too much energy and power away from the higher brain and you're becoming weaker and weaker. And it's almost like we were Superman or Superwoman for most of human history. We were survival machines. We were incredible, dynamic, adaptable. But then suddenly we landed in this world and we started becoming weaker and weaker and weaker as we became all the things that we wanted: thinking, information, communication, sex, sugar, fear, anxiety, pride. All these things were available in droves and droves, and it was too much and started to take over. And so what's very interesting is the story gets even worse before it gets better. Aside from getting the high, we also had this other survival mechanism, which was the stress response. And for most of human history, stress represented, as we discussed, a risk to our lives. Okay? But the problem is that in modern times, the lower brain doesn't know how to make a distinction between ancient stress and modern day stress. But for most of human history, how did we deal with the risk to our lives? The best way to deal with the predator and the climate and the famine was basically to disappear into the proverbial cave and hibernate. And the key to hibernating was to pack on enough calories and drive down the burn rate of your calories so you'd last for a couple months. And it turns out that there's one magical hormone that can do both of those. That turns out to be the stress hormone, the stress response hormone, cortisol. What people know about cortisol, most people know, and most physicians know, that cortisol increases fat deposition. But the piece of the puzzle that a lot of people haven't put together, and I did just by chance, is that cortisol also starts to empty the bucket. So what it does is it starts to drive down the production of neurotransmitters, key hormones, and starts to even deactivate the higher brain. And so in effect, what it's doing is it's causing a leak in your bucket because it's trying to drain you. You're losing your energy, you're losing your inspiration, you're losing your motivation in order to preserve calories. So depression and anxiety really are smart response systems to what's perceived as a threat to our lives. Stress, 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 stress equals risk of dying according to the lower brain. And so the lower brain steps in and says, hey, you know what? I'll help you. I'm going to deactivate the upper brain and we're going to preserve our calories and then we'll be able to hibernate as long as we need to. And so all the cravings that are out there result in a diversion of blood flow to the lower brain. Too much stress causes a deactivation of the higher brain. Two big problems. The problem gets even worse yet. But I assure you there's a silver lining here eventually. And so for most of human history, you were able to disappear into the proverbial cave, hibernate, and that was fine. But now what's happened, we woke up, we want to go into hibernation mode, but the cave disappeared, and we go, eek, what happened to my cave? And we're looking around, and you're still out in the world, you're still engaged in the world, but you're running on empty. But the lower brain is designed to get high. And so lower brain's saying, come on, give me the high, where's the high? We need it, because we need it to survive. We will not back down on that request. And so what ends up happening is, you are forced to be in sort of addiction mode, looking for quick highs. And lo and behold, as we discussed, they're all over the place. The internet, texting, yada, yada, yada. And so that's a problem. So now you're forced to go into addiction mode. And so there's kind of a vicious cycle that starts to happen. Now you're doing even more diversion and even more deactivation. You're going on empty. That's causing even more addiction propensity. It's a horrible cycle. And that's really happening to millions of people that are getting addicted to the outside high, if you will. So that's what's going on. You get a 20-year radical departure, and of course, after hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of programming, and now suddenly you have access to all this candy, I call it even kryptonite, what do you think is going to happen? Of course millions of people are going to start to become destabilized because they're not used to this, they're not prepared for this. And so, not only is there a problem with the leaking bucket and diverting away from the higher brain, you're also not spending time activating the higher brain directly, as we talked about earlier. And if you look at brain scans of people who have obesity, drug addiction, alcoholism, depression, anxiety. It's very interesting. They all look very similar. They all have the higher brain being more and more silent. So basically they're all moving towards empty. They all look the same on brain scans. And so that model really explains a lot of the problems that we're having in the world. And then the desire to compensate for that can then in turn explain a lot of the imbalance in the world, which then leads to even more suffering and problems. And so we got ourselves a problem here. Now, on a craving continuum, it's very easy to kind of write off substance abuse folks as the bad ones, drug addiction, alcohol addiction. But the reality is that all these cravings, information, communication, pride, fear, anxiety, they all cause neurotransmitter spikes. They all act the same as drugs do. It's a matter of just being how severe. But in time, all these outside highs will catch up with you by making you weaker and weaker over time. So don't conveniently categorize the substance abuse people as being the addicts. We all suffer from addiction, and we need to confront that in order to become more powerful. And really, in fact, for the wealthy set, they have their own problem, which is they have so much access to all these things that stimulate the craving centers, and they also have a lot more stress by virtue of keeping a lot more balls up in the air, and there's a tendency to have more complexity, which then leads to more triggering of the lower brain, more stress, and distraction from activation of the upper brain. So just because you're wealthy does not insulate you from the problem of the empty bucket. In fact, you may be even greater risk for it if you don't protect yourself. And so, to me, I even look at depression, anxiety, and addiction as signs of power. We need to stop having shame about those things because we have this elegant, powerful design that's meant to take over and help us survive. And now, like Superman, we've landed in a world of kryptonite, and so it's triggering all these problems, and we're designed to be taken over and be driven automatically. So you cannot beat yourself up. Scientists more and more disavowing the idea that we have free will in the manner that we think we do. And so it's time for us to have a software upgrade in order to deal with the viruses and kryptonite that are out there, in order for us to deal with progressive emptying, weakening, and all the domino effect of problems. And so what do? Okay, what's the solution to this? Now, as my life progressed, the career part of me, I recovered. My friend's bookshelf saved me, and I became more and more effective at the career part of self-improvement. But an interesting thing happened is that I became addicted to success. I became a type A personality. I was driven by time management. I was driven by goals. And so, in effect, I revealed an emptiness that I was trying to fill, and I kind of went a little bit overboard. And so thankfully I had my wife and my kids there as a mirror to show me the kind of person that I was becoming. By creating suffering for them, by virtue of how I was behaving, I realized that something was wrong in the way I was approaching life. So the question was, can I have my cake and eat it too? Can I be successful and be a nice person? What's happened to me here? And so the inner journey continued, the self-improvement journey continued. I was very lucky to run into a physician, never saw him before or never saw him afterwards. One day ran into him about 10 years ago in the physician's lounge at the hospital I worked at, and he taught me about a couple of resources online for various kinds, a whole array of practices that can be used and the science behind them and how they can affect you in a positive way. And so, whereas philosophy didn't help me with my anger issues and my addiction to goals and time management and mood swings, these various inner practices did help me. Bren Brown, in a famous TED Talk, refers to the idea of vulnerability being the key to being emotionally intelligent and happy. And I totally agree with that. But becoming vulnerable is not an easy thing to do. But what's interesting about inner practices and becoming more full bucket is that I automatically also started becoming more vulnerable and therefore was able to heal myself even more rapidly. And so as going back through the list of problems in the mirror, over time what happened was I became a lot more tolerant of criticism, a lot more tolerant of failure, a lot more free with my time, a lot less obsessed with time management and my goals. Clinical scenarios that would have horrified me 15 years ago and stressed me out, now they're almost like out-of-body experiences. I had almost no stress with near-death types of patient scenarios that I was taking care of in a critical care environment. So a remarkable change started occurring in my inner structure that other kinds of approaches couldn't achieve. And so the question was this a placebo effect in my head, or was there some evidence to justify that these practices actually helped me? And so it turns out that there's an unbelievable amount of evidence out there to show you that, in fact, activating the higher brain indeed creates the vital mix going up, as we said, filling the bucket and causing the most important things to happen in your life. Tolerance goes up, love goes up, peace goes up, creativity goes up, resilience goes up. All the things that matter go up as you activate the higher brain. And there's hundreds of studies to validate that point. And so I was inspired to share these ideas with other people, but it was difficult for a lot of people to get off the ground. And so the question was, what was going on? And the other piece of the puzzle was coming together, which is the lower brain was going on, the survival machine was going on. And the survival machine for most of human history has been sort of a hero, a superhero. To me, the upper brain is Superman. But once upon a time, the lower brain was also Superman or Superwoman. It helped us survive for hundreds of thousands of years. But what happened was that superhero became turned by the modern world and became a villain, kind of like a story. And it's the one that's really sort of taken over and caused these problems of diversion and deactivation and addiction. And so it cannot be taken lightly. In fact, the lower brain is so powerful, and as I said earlier, the subconscious mind has such an ability to take over and run us automatically. We often make decisions and have behaviors that we don't even know why we do them, but we fill in excuses for why we do them. And so, it's critical. That's why we call this the scientific conscious life. It's critical to be aware of how you use your time, because the subconscious mind and the lower brain will have a propensity for taking over and making excuses and distracting you away from devoting time to the things that really matter and making you more powerful, filling your bucket. And so science, because it's critical for you to measure how much time you invest in what we'll talk about, 4 quick categories here, and then measure the effect on your life. You become a scientist basically in your own journey. You measure how much time you put in, and then you see the result on things like how much stress do I tolerate, how much more love do I feel, how much non-judgment, how much self-acceptance goes up, does my brain start to function better, does my health improve? All these things are predicted to happen as the bucket fills up. But the critical thing is to devote enough time to it, and then as you see a correlation with improvement, you're hooked on a positive thing. So there's the competition between the lower brain and the higher brain. Lower brain, we already talked about the fact that there's a lot of diversion that happens by virtue of activating the lower brain from all the outer highs that are out there: communication, texting, internet, information, pridefulness, gossiping, all these things. That competes basically with time devoted to upper brain activation, which is I call the inner high. So the competition between outer high and the inner high. And it's important to restrict how much time you're devoting to the outer high and devote as much time as possible to the inner high, because in time, paradoxically, you'll become even more successful and happy than you can imagine. Another competition that's happening is between the danger signal and the safety signal. The danger signal is that the stress response basically says, oh, it's dangerous out there. We need to open up the bucket and drain the bucket and go into hibernation mode. And so a very simple way to deal with the danger signal is to stop judging people and life situations as good or bad. The message bad is what creates stress. And the reality is that in any situation, it's impossible to know the domino effect of life circumstances that are going to happen. It's almost impossible to truly label a situation as bad and know that that's accurate. So stop judging situations as good or bad. And people also, we now know how powerful we are being taken over and being driven. There is very little free will until you become more self-aware. And so people who are behaving badly are doing so because that's the kind of programming that they had in their lives. And they aren't aware of the problem of the empty bucket and the addiction mode. Until they can be taught those things, we shouldn't be so harsh towards them. So if you stop, the benefit to you, though, of not judging people and circumstances as good or bad is that you start dropping off the stress response and stop the leak in the bucket. And finally, the safety signal is We need to challenge ourselves all the time, be on the edge of our comfort zone, learning new skills, applying these skills, making new relationships, building new teams, being more self-aware, being more self-honest. All these things, edge of the comfort zone, send a signal to the lower brain that life is safe out there. We're engaging life. We're at spring on the savannah, and we're in the game, we're in the hunt, and so it's safe. And so we can produce all the hormones and chemicals that are necessary also to fill the bucket. But by far the most powerful of all is the activation of the higher brain and the need to devote time to some kind of meditation. The more time, the better. Silence is the key. Don't worry about how good you are at it. Over time, silence becomes more and more pervasive. Noise of the lower brain chatter starts to go away more and more over time. So don't be so hard on yourself and put so much pressure on yourself to just stop thinking. No need for that. Over time, it'll just happen automatically. And so basically, there's this battle between, the inner high and the outer high. There's battle between silence and noise. And these are the things that will really determine if you'll be sustainably happy or not, as well as how effective you will be in your career and your relationship. So really, everything that matters is affected by how full or empty your bucket is. And like I said, you can become a scientist in your own journey by measuring how much time you put in to these 4 categories and what the result is, and you'll notice changes happening without a doubt. And so the world is kind of going in a scary direction, but we can take back control over the world and our lives by focusing on the inner high versus the outer high. And as you have more and more love and joy and peace and resilience that appear by activating the higher brain, you become more fearless. And as you're more fearless, you ask the questions that you need to ask, and you are able to shape your life in the way that you need to, despite the turbulence of the world changing so rapidly. And there's less of a tendency to have a hoarding mentality in order to kind of self-medicate when given that the empty bucket is there. Outer highs are not sustainable, and they are ultimately self-destructive. Eventually you got to turn on the inner highs in order to really fill the bucket, stop the leaking, and protect ourselves from kryptonite. There's a famous saying from Shantideva, a Buddhist monk, and I'm not religious, and I'm certainly not anti-religious either. But a Buddhist monk named Shantideva had a famous saying that joy is produced by concern for the happiness of others. Suffering is produced by concern for our own happiness. And the higher brain, lower brain, full bucket versus empty bucket model explains that the more we do for others and the more balanced we are in our lives, the less addiction focused we are, the more self-focused we are, the more paradoxically happy and powerful we become. It's sort of a fascinating spiritual paradox, and now we have a biological model to explain, and that's pretty cool. And so in every moment we have a choice between power versus addiction, love versus fear, silence versus noise. This choice, it's critical for us to choose power in order to become a superhero role model for others in a world full of kryptonite. And it's important for us to elevate each other then and become more conscious of these 4 categories in order to fill our buckets and save the world before it's too late. What's your number? Thank you.